Maddox never thought his family's troubles could get worse. His mother had been bedridden for weeks with no sign of recovery, the doctor's promises growing thinner by the day. His own bones ached from the endless work on the ranch, but even the endless dust and scorching sun couldn't wash away the gnawing sense of helplessness that clung to him. His father had passed when Maddox was just a boy, and his brothers had scattered, each with their own life to live. It was just him, his mother, and this vast stretch of desert that had once given them everything. Now, it felt like it was taking it all away. The cattle had been thinner than usual, and no matter how much Maddox pushed himself, the land seemed to resist every effort. Crops failed, the river ran dry, and the wind was never kind. Every time he thought he had a handle on things, another problem emerged. He didn't have anyone to turn to, no one to help shoulder the weight of his world. His mother's declining health was the final blow. She had been his anchor, the one constant in his life, and now, watching her fade away in the bed she once filled with life was like losing her all over again. But on that blistering hot afternoon, things took a turn he hadn't expected. A woman appeared. Clara. She was a stranger, and Maddox had no idea where she came from. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by ranches for work, but this woman carried something different. A quiet, steady confidence that made him feel like there was something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "I'm here to help," she said, as if she had been expected. No introduction, no need for a greeting. Just those simple words that hung in the air, as if they were the answer to a prayer Maddox hadn't yet spoken. Her voice was soft, but it had a firmness to it, like someone who had seen hard times and learned how to face them head on. And her eyes, there was something in those eyes that made Maddox believe her without question. Maybe it was the kindness, or maybe it was the tiredness that matched his own. It was a strange thing to trust a complete stranger, but when you've been isolated for so long, sometimes that's exactly what you need. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with politeness, "I don't reckon you're much for resting when there's work to be done, are you?" She gave him a quick, almost amused smile. "Not really," she said, her gaze turning toward the house. "I'm more concerned about your mother right now. I've heard she's been struggling." Maddox's heart tightened, his mind battling between disbelief and relief. He didn't know how she knew about his mother, or how she knew he needed help so badly, but something told him that it didn't matter. She had come at the right time. He just didn't know how right it was yet. "I reckon we could use all the help we can get," he said, his voice a bit softer. Clara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked right past him, entering the house like she had a place there, like she had been expected, and started to tend to his mother. Maddox stood frozen for a moment on the porch, unsure of what to do. He had been struggling for so long, keeping everything together in his mind, and now this woman, this stranger, was stepping into his life without hesitation, taking over what he couldn't fix. It felt both strange and comforting. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew this: she wasn't just here for his mother, she wasn't just a caregiver. No, Clara was doing something that went beyond nursing. She was healing. At first it wasn't easy for Maddox to accept it. He watched from a distance as Clara cleaned his mother's wounds, administered medicine, and even sat with her for hours just talking to her. Clara was quiet and gentle, but there was an air of command in the way she took charge. She never asked for permission. She simply knew what needed to be done, and Maddox couldn't find a reason to argue. Days turned into weeks, and the difference in his mother was impossible to ignore. She started sitting up more, eating, speaking. Her once faint voice grew stronger with every passing day, and the joy that had been missing from her face began to return. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her smile like that, or heard her laugh in that light, easy way that had once filled their home. But it wasn't just his mother who was changing. Slowly, without even realizing it, Clara was starting to change the house, the land, the very atmosphere. At first it seemed small. She'd tidy up a little, sweep the porch, water the plant. But then she'd step outside to the fields, taking note of the cattle, the fences, the crops, and bit by bit, the ranch seemed to breathe again, just like his mother. It wasn't much at first, just signs of life here and there, but it made all the difference. Maddox was still reluctant to accept Clara's presence though. He'd spent so many years doing things his own way, keeping his head down and his hands in the dirt, that the idea of someone else stepping in felt wrong in a way. And yet he couldn't deny how much easier everything seemed with her around. It was like the weight on his shoulders had lightened, even if he wasn't ready to admit it to himself. One night after a long day of work, Clara sat him down on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The desert air was cool, the sky streaked with colors of amber and purple, and for the first time in a long while, Maddox felt a quiet peace wash over him. "You don't have to do it alone," Clara said, her voice soft but steady, as though she had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Maddox didn't say anything at first. He just stared out at the land, the same land that had brought him so much pride and so much pain. He'd spent years carrying this place, carrying his family's name, carrying the weight of expectation. But now, with Clara here, he couldn't help but feel like the ground beneath him was a little firmer. "I've been doing this for so long," he finally muttered, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how to ask for help." Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful, understanding. "You don't have to ask for it," she said gently. "Help doesn't always come in the way we think it will. Sometimes it just shows up when we least expect it." He didn't reply. His pride, that stubborn piece of him that had always kept him going, still held tight. But deep down, he knew she was right. He didn't have to do it alone anymore. And just like that, he realized something had shifted inside of him, inside his home, inside his family. Maddox wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: Clara wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was becoming part of something much bigger than a mere healer or caretaker. She was becoming a force that Maddox couldn't ignore, a force that was healing the cracks in his broken family, even if he didn't fully understand how it was happening. The days rolled on like tumbleweeds, carried by a wind that seemed to blow in from another time. Clara had become part of the landscape now, as natural as the sun setting over the mesa. It was strange how quickly she had integrated into their lives, how easily she had become a steady force in a world that had been out of balance for so long. Maddox still found himself uneasy at times, uncertain of where his role began and where hers ended. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of someone else taking on the burdens he'd carried for years, even in such a quiet, competent way, felt like he was losing control. He'd been the one to handle everything: his mother's sickness, the ranch's survival, his family's legacy, and now, with Clara in the mix, it felt as though things were slipping away, and he wasn't sure how to grab hold of them again. But the changes didn't stop. His mother, once a frail shadow of the woman she used to be, was getting stronger by the day. Her laughter, light and free, was returning to the house like a breeze after a long hot spell. Clara had worked magic, that was certain, but there was more happening here than just physical recovery. The house felt warmer, the land felt fuller, as if the very earth beneath them was responding to the healing taking place. It was a strange thing to feel like life was coming back, but to be unsure if he was ready to accept it. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a soft golden glow, Maddox found Clara sitting on the porch, gazing out over the land. She was always quiet in those moments, lost in thought, but Maddox couldn't help but wonder what she was really thinking. Was she feeling the same discomfort he was? Was she aware that her presence was shifting things in ways he didn't quite understand? "Clara," he said, his voice rough, the silence between them growing thick with the unsaid. "I reckon it's time to talk about this." She didn't look at him immediately, but instead kept her gaze fixed on the far-off horizon. "Talk about what?" she asked, her tone calm but with that undertone of quiet strength that Maddox had come to respect. "This." Maddox waved his hand, as if encompassing the ranch, his mother, the land, and everything between them. "This situation, you being here, the way things are changing." Clara turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "What about it?" Maddox took a deep breath. "I ain't used to this. I ain't used to letting someone else take over." His voice tightened, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "I've been carrying this load for years, and now, here you are, making everything better, fixing what's been broken, and I don't know where I fit in." Clara finally looked at him, her eyes soft yet piercing, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to say without needing him to finish. "You don't have to carry it all anymore, Maddox. That's the thing. You've done your part. You've carried your family, your land, your burdens, But there's more to life than just carrying it. He shifted uncomfortably, not used to hearing this from anyone, least of all someone who hadn't been with him through the years of hardship. I've never known how to let go. You can't just turn your back on things you've fought for. I'm not asking you to turn your back, Clara said gently, her voice like a breeze softening the rough edges of his words. I'm just saying that sometimes it's okay to let someone else hold up the weight for a while. Sometimes it's okay to be held, instead of always holding. Her words struck him like a thunderclap, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the weight of it, the weight of the years spent alone, carrying a family legacy that wasn't his to carry alone. He had built walls around himself, walls that kept everyone at a distance, including himself. But Clara was different. She hadn't asked to be part of the family, hadn't asked to share the burden. But somehow she had done it without a word, without even trying. I don't know how to do that, Maddox confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. How to let go. I'm used to holding everything together, used to doing it myself. Clara's gaze softened as she stood up from the porch, walking over to him, her presence strong but calm. You've carried it alone for a long time, but it doesn't have to be that way anymore. You've got people now, Maddox, and sometimes all you need to do is let them help. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Maddox wasn't sure if he was ready to let go, but for the first time he could see the possibility of it. It was like a door had opened in his heart, just a crack, and the light that seeped through felt both strange and comforting. As the days passed, Maddox found himself growing more comfortable with the changes Clara had brought to his life. He watched his mother's health improve, her spirit lifted by the care and attention Clara provided. He saw the way Clara spoke to his mother, the way she made her laugh again, the way she brought a sense of peace into a house that had once been filled with nothing but tension and worry. Clara's presence, once an intrusion, was now a balm, soothing the wounds he hadn't even realized were still open. But even as the peace settled in, Maddox felt a new kind of tension. It wasn't a bad tension, but it was still there, lingering like a shadow in the corner of his mind. He had known for a while that Clara wasn't just a healer. She was something more. She was a force, one that had swept into his life and turned everything upside down. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever that more was. One night after they had finished the evening chores and his mother had retired to her room for the night, Maddox sat on the porch again, the cool night air settling around him like a blanket. Clara joined him moments later, her presence as steady as ever. Clara, Maddox began, his voice heavy with something he hadn't been able to name until now. You've done so much for me and my family. You've healed us in ways I can't even explain. She didn't speak immediately, just listen. He could feel her patience, her calmness, even as he struggled to find the right words. I don't know how to say this, Maddox continued, his voice thick with emotion, but I reckon I'm grateful, more than I can say. He paused, looking down at his hands, the weight of his own admission pressing on him. I don't want to lose this, lose you. Clara's gaze softened, and for the first time since she arrived, Maddox saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. Vulnerability. You won't lose me, Maddox. Not unless you want to. I'm here because I choose to be. But it's up to you too. You don't have to do this alone anymore. But you do have to let me in. The words hung between them, a quiet truth that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge. Maddox took a deep breath, his chest tight, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he could breathe. I reckon that's what scares me, he admitted, letting someone in, letting go of the reins. Clara smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. You don't have to let go all at once, Maddox. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to do everything on your own. For the first time, Maddox believed her. Maybe it wasn't all going to fall apart. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he realized that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders alone, that there was someone who was willing to share the load. And with Clara by his side, Maddox realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be afraid of what was coming next. The desert was vast, its horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky at night was a dome of stars, a deep, endless canvas that seemed to swallow everything beneath it. But as Maddox stood on the porch, looking out over the land he had worked his whole life to tame, he realized something had shifted. The night, the wind, the earth beneath his boots, They all felt different now. There was something new in the air, something that hadn't been there before, something that made the silence less lonely, the dark less oppressive. And it was Clara. Since she had arrived, there had been a slow, almost imperceptible change in everything. The ranch was no longer just a place of survival, it was becoming a home again. The heavy burden that had weighed on Maddox for so long had started to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that brought hope in its wake. But as much as he had come to appreciate Clara's presence, as much as he had allowed her into his mother's life, into the land, there was still that nagging fear inside him, the fear of what it would mean to truly open up to her, to trust her completely. Maddox had always relied on his own strength. The idea of someone else sharing in that burden had once felt like a threat, but now, with Clara's steady support, it was starting to feel like the one thing that could save him. But how could he truly how could he stop holding the reins so tightly when they had been in his hands for so long? The sound of footsteps on the porch broke him from his thoughts. He turned to find Clara standing a few paces away, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the house. "Maddox," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Can we talk?" He nodded, stepping aside to let her join him. They stood together in the quiet, the only sounds the soft wind that rustled the trees and the distant calls of coyotes. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and Maddox knew that Clara had something to say, something important. "I've been thinking about the way things have been," Clara began, her voice tinged with a quiet strength. "And I think we need to talk about where we're going from here. Not just with your mama but with everything. The ranch, you, me." Her words cut through the silence like a knife, and Maddox felt a strange tightness in his chest. "I don't understand," he said, his voice rough. "What do you?" Clara turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "I think you're starting to trust me. I can see it in the way you look at me, the way you've started letting me help. But there's still something holding you back, and I need to know if you're ready to let go of that fear, ready to trust, not just me but us, the future." Maddox looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of her words felt heavy, like an anchor pulling at him from the inside. He wasn't sure how to respond. How could he explain the knot in his chest, the fear that had always kept him at a distance from everyone? How could he put into words the vulnerability that had been hidden away for so long? "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can let go. I've spent so long keeping everything together. I'm not sure what will happen if I don't." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady as she watched him. "Maddox," she said softly, "holding on so tight is exhausting. You don't have to be the one who holds everything together all the time. You've got me now, and you don't have to do it alone anymore." Her words sank into him like water into dry soil, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the truth of them. He had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long, had convinced himself that it was his responsibility to hold everything together. But Clara was right. He didn't have to do it alone. And yet, it was terrifying to think about opening up to her, to let her truly in. The silence between them deepened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the world around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. And Maddox knew that the change had to come from him. "I don't know what this is, Clara," he said finally, his voice filled with a raw honesty he hadn't allowed himself to show before. "I don't know what we're doing, but I do know that I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I can't keep pretending that I've got it all figured out." Clara reached out then, her hand resting gently on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Maddox. Nobody does. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. One step at a time." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. For so long, he had believed that love and trust had to be earned, had to be fought for. But Clara was offering him something different, something deeper, something that didn't require him to earn it. It was a gift, a quiet promise of partnership. For the first time, Maddox realized that he had been so afraid of losing control, of losing his independence, that he had missed out on the possibility of something more. Clara wasn't asking him to give up everything he had worked for. She wasn't asking him to sacrifice his pride or his land. She was asking him to allow her into his life, into his heart, to share in the journey ahead. and as much as it scared him, Maddox knew it was what he needed. "Okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, Clara, I'll try. I'll try. I'll try to trust. I'll try to let go." Clara smiled then, a soft, knowing smile that made Maddox feel like he was finally shedding the skin he had carried for so long. The fear that had once gripped him so tightly began to loosen its hold, and for the first time he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't even know if he was ready for everything that would come next, but he knew that he wasn't alone anymore, and that somehow made all the difference. Clara's presence was like a steadying hand on his shoulder, guiding him through the days when the weight of everything still felt heavy. But Maddox was learning to lean on her, learning to trust in the quiet strength she offered without hesitation. His mother continued to improve, and the ranch slowly began to show signs of life. The cattle were fattening up, the crops were beginning to thrive, and the land that had once felt like a battlefield now seemed to hum with possibility. But it wasn't just the ranch that was changing, it was Maddox himself. He wasn't the same man who had stood on this porch a few weeks ago, consumed by fear and pride. He was beginning to understand that strength didn't come from carrying everything alone. It came from knowing when to ask for help, when to let someone else take the reins. And in Clara, Maddox had found the kind of help he never knew he needed. More than that, he had found someone he could trust, someone who wasn't afraid to stand by his side and face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but with Clara there, it didn't feel as daunting as it once had. Maddox looked out at the horizon once more. The sky stretched wide and endless before him, and for the first time he didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel like he was standing on the edge of something. Instead, he felt like he was finally starting to walk into a new life, with Clara by his side, ready to face whatever came their way together. The days stretched on, turning into weeks, and the slow change that had begun with Clara's arrival was becoming undeniable. It was as if the very air in the desert had shifted lighter, more open, and filled with the hum of life that had been absent for so long. Maddox stood at the fence one evening, watching the cattle move through the pasture. The sun was setting behind the mesas, casting long, golden shadows across the land. It was beautiful, too beautiful, sometimes for someone who had grown used to the harshness of the desert. His thoughts often drifted to Clara, to the way she had become a steady presence in his life, both in his heart and in the way she cared for the ranch. She had brought balance to a life that had been tipped off kilter for too long. But it was more than. She had started something inside him that he wasn't ready to face, something deep and unfamiliar. It was the way he looked at her now, how his chest tightened whenever she was near. It was the way his world seemed brighter when she smiled, the way his heart raced when she touched him, those small gestures that told him everything he hadn't been able to say. And yet Maddox wasn't sure he was ready to name it. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what it would mean for everything they had built together, for all the healing Clara had brought, for all the ways she had made his world better. There was still a part of him that clung to the edges, afraid to dive in fully. He had spent so long living on his own, carving out his place in the world with nothing but his strength and his determination. He had been afraid that if he let someone in, they would take everything he had worked for. But Clara hadn't come to take anything from him. She had come to share, to build, to help him heal. And now, Maddox was standing at the edge of something that could change everything. Clara appeared beside him, her steps light and easy on the dry ground. She stood there for a moment watching the cattle with him. The evening breeze ruffled her hair and the sun kissed her skin with a warm golden light. He didn't know what it was about the way she looked at that moment, standing beside him, as though she belonged there. But something in his chest stirred, thinking about the future. She asked, her voice soft but full of understanding. She had a way of reading him, of knowing what was on his mind, without him having to say it. And right now, she was right. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the cattle. Yeah, about a lot of. Clara glanced at him, her eyes searching, then back out at the horizon. Things are different now, aren't they? The question was simple, but it hit him in the gut. They were different, and the changes weren't just about the ranch or his mother's health. They were about him, about the way he saw the world and about the way he was starting to see her. Different in what way, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled faintly, the expression both knowing and gentle. I think you know what I mean. Maddox hesitated, unsure of how to respond. His thoughts were swirling, and the weight of them felt like it might crush him if he didn't release it somehow. He had kept so much inside, had held back from so much for so long, but with Clara there beside him, it was getting harder to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. "I don't know what to make of it all," he said finally, his words rough. "I've never been good at this kind of thing, Clara." He stopped himself, not sure how to finish the thought. "At what?" She prodded gently, taking a small step closer. "At letting someone in, at letting go." His voice cracked on the last part, the admission feeling like something both painful and freeing. "I've spent so long doing it all on my own, taking care of my mother, the ranch, everything. It feels like if I let go now, I'll lose it all." Clara didn't say anything for a long moment, but when she did, her voice was calm, steady. "You're not going to lose anything, Maddox. If you let go, you're not giving up what you built. You're just letting someone help you carry it. Letting me help you. And maybe that's the thing you've needed all along." Maddox felt her words sink into him, but they didn't come easily. The idea of sharing the load, of letting someone else take the reins for a while, was something foreign to him. It was as though he had spent so many years carrying the weight of the world that he had forgotten what it felt like to walk without it pressing down on his shoulders. "Maybe," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you're right." Clara didn't push him. She just stood there beside him, her presence a quiet reassurance that for once he didn't have to do it alone. The evening stretched on, the sky fading from gold to purple to black, as the stars began to appear. Maddox stood there with Clara, the wind picking up as night settled in. And for the first time in a long while he felt at peace. It wasn't just the ranch, the cattle or the land, it was Clara. It was the way she had come into his life like a gentle breeze, bringing with her the promise of something new, something he hadn't known he needed. But there was something else in the air now, something Maddox couldn't ignore. It wasn't just peace, it was longing. It was the way his heart beat faster when she was near, the way he wanted to reach out and touch her, to pull her closer and never let her go. He wasn't sure what it meant, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew one thing for certain. Clara had become the center of his world in a way that he hadn't expected. "I think I'm ready," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was a new certainty in it, a new openness that hadn't been there before. Clara turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Ready for what?" "To trust you," he said simply. "To let go. Share this with you. All of it." Her smile was slow, but it was the kind of smile that made his heart flutter. "You don't have to do it all at once, Maddox. We'll take it one step at a time, together." For the first time Maddox felt like he could breathe. The weight that had been pressing on his chest was lighter now, and the fear that had kept him from truly trusting anyone, especially Clara, was starting to fade. It wasn't about letting go completely. It was about letting someone in, trusting that they wouldn't take from him, but that they would add to his life in ways he hadn't known were possible. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice low but full of emotion. "But I'm glad you're here." Clara reached out then, her hand brushing his arm, a soft touch that sent a shock of warmth through him. "You do deserve this, Maddox. You just need to believe it." And then, without another word, Clara stepped closer, her eyes never leaving him. The world seemed to hold its breath as their faces drew nearer. The tension, the longing that had been building between them exploded in that moment, and without thinking, without questioning it, Maddox leaned in and kissed her. It was slow at first, tentative, as if both of them were still unsure of what this moment meant. But as the kiss deepened, Maddox felt something inside him shift, something powerful and undeniable. It was as though he had spent his whole life waiting for this moment, for this woman, and now that it was here, he didn't want to let it go. When they pulled away, Clara's eyes were wide, her breath a little shallow. She didn't say anything at first, but Maddox could see the truth in her gaze, the same truth he had felt in his heart all along. "I think I'm ready too," she whispered, and in that moment, Maddox knew that everything was about to change. Not just for the ranch, not just for his mother, but for him and for Clara. Together, they would face whatever came next, and whatever it was, they would face it together. The desert never stayed still. It shifted beneath the heat of the sun, its dry sands whirling into dust storms only to settle again into the quiet stillness of the night. Yet in the midst of all its ancient untamed chaos, the land had a rhythm, and for the first time in years, Maddox felt like he was finally catching that rhythm, As the weeks passed after their first kiss, things began to shift between him and Clara. There were moments of uncertainty, moments when the old walls he'd built around himself started to creep back up. He was used to standing alone, to carrying the weight of everything by himself. It had been easier, he told himself, because he didn't have to rely on anyone else. But now, with Clara by his side, the walls that had kept him separate from the world and from his own heart were starting to crumble. It wasn't an easy journey. They had their disagreements, their moments of silence, their days when the weight of it all felt like it might break them. But every time Clara looked at him with those steady eyes, every time she reached out and reminded him that they were in this together, he felt the walls fall just a little more. It wasn't just about love, it was about partnership, about giving and receiving in ways he had never imagined. It was early in the morning when Maddox stood at the edge of the property, looking out at the land. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in streaks of pink and orange, and he could hear the distant call of birds in the brush. The cattle were grazing in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of dry earth mixed with the promise of rain. But the sky was clear, the storm had passed, and with that, Maddox knew that the storm inside him had passed too. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Clara stood there, her face soft with the quiet knowledge that had become her trademark. She was wearing her usual work clothes, a faded shirt and trousers, her hair tied back in a simple braid. She had a way of carrying herself, of moving through the world with calm determination, that made everything around her feel like it was in its right place. "You're up early," Clara said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maddox nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, as though the very act of speaking the thoughts out loud would make them more real. "About what?" she asked, stepping closer, her presence both grounding and comforting. "About us, about what comes next." Clara's eyes softened, and she walked up beside him, standing just a little closer than usual. "I thought we'd been figuring that out already." "We have," Maddox agreed, "but I'm talking about the bigger picture, about what we want, what we need. I reckon we've both spent so long just surviving, me with the ranch, and you, with everything you've carried in your own life. But I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to build something, a life, a future, with you." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was no ranch, no cattle, no land to worry about, just the two of them, standing on the edge of a new beginning. "You know," Clara said after a long pause, "when I first came here, I never expected any of this. I didn't know how much of a future there could be in a place like this, how much could be built from the dust and the dirt." She paused, her voice turning thoughtful. "But now, with you, I can see it. I can see a future, a life. It's not perfect, but it's real, and that's all I need." Maddox turned to face her fully now, his heart hammering in his chest. For so long, he had been afraid of what letting someone in would mean. He had been afraid that by opening his heart, he would lose everything. But now, with Clara beside him, he knew something different. He knew that love didn't take away, it added, it built, it made everything stronger, more real. "I'm ready," Maddox said, his voice thick with emotion, "ready to build it with you, whatever it takes, whatever comes next." Clara's eyes shone with something Maddox couldn't name, but he didn't need to. He could feel it in her touch, as she placed her hand gently on his arm. "We'll build it together," she whispered, and that was the promise that bound them. The days that followed were full of work, but they were different. There was a rhythm now, a steady flow to their days that felt right. They spent their mornings tending to the ranch, managing the cattle, repairing fences, and making sure the land was healthy. But it wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the life they were creating. As the seasons changed, so did the ranch. The crops started to yield more than they ever had before. The cattle grew strong and healthy. The land, which had once felt like it was slipping through his fingers, was now thriving, nurtured by the hands of two people who were learning to trust each other more every day. Even his mother, who had been the glue that held this place together for so long, had started to regain her strength. The quiet, tender care that Clara had given her had worked wonders, and Maddox couldn't help but marvel at the way the house had come alive again. There were evenings now when his mother would sit in the rocking chair by the window, watching the sunset and telling stories of the past, and Maddox would find Clara beside her, listening just as intently. The house, once a place of solitude and isolation, was now filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of everyday life. Clara had become an irreplaceable part of it, and Maddox found himself wondering how he had ever gotten by without her. But as the days grew warmer and the summer stretched on, Maddox knew that there was still something important left unsaid between them, something that had been hanging in the air ever since that first kiss. They had built a life, a partnership, but they hadn't truly talked about what it all meant. Not yet. And he wasn't sure if it was the right time, but the thought of leaving it unspoken weighed heavily on him. One evening, as they were finishing up the day's work and the sun dipped low in the sky, Maddox found himself standing in the barn, watching Clara with a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite explain. She was brushing down one of the horses, her movements fluid and graceful, and he realized, with a sudden clarity, that this woman had become everything to him. She had taken the pieces of his broken world and put them together in a way he hadn't thought possible. She had brought him peace, love, and a future he didn't know he could have. And now it was time to make it real. "Clara," he called softly. She turned, wiping her hands on a rag. "What is it, Maddox?" He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been thinking about everything we've built, about you and me. I can't imagine doing this without you. I don't want to. I want you by my side for all of it, through the good and the bad." Her expression softened, her eyes warm with something he couldn't quite place. "Maddox, what are you saying?" He took a deep breath, reaching out to take her hand in his. "I'm saying that I don't want to live without you. I want you to be a part of my life, my future, forever." Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes searching his face. And then, without another word, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. For a moment, all he could feel was the warmth of her body, the softness of her lips as she kissed him deeply, as if she was sealing the promise he had just made. When they pulled away, there was a new understanding between them, a new certainty that neither of them had ever felt before. "Forever," she whispered. And in that moment, Maddox knew that the journey they had started was just the beginning. They were going to build something beautiful, something that would stand the test of time, just like the land they had worked so hard to nurture. As the seasons turned, the future that Maddox and Clara built together grew stronger. Their love became the foundation of everything they touched, and with each passing day their partnership grew deeper. The ranch thrived, his mother's health improved, and the once lonely house was now a place of joy and laughter. Maddox and Clara had learned that love wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about building a future, step by step, hand in hand. And in the quiet moments as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the desert, Maddox knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Their love, like the land they had nurtured, would grow and endure, a testament to the strength of trust, partnership, and the future they had built from the dust of the desert.